Welcome, my name is Johan Norberg and this is my first lecture for the Liberal Academy called What is Globalization? An Introduction. Globalization is one of the most talked about phenomena in the last few decades in world politics and world economics. But what is it? Most people focus on one of the things that begin to travel across borders more than they used to do. Often it's about different relations between various governments in the world. Some people focus on the growing clout and interest in multinational institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF and the European Union. And some focus on multinational corporations, the fact that more companies now have various activities in many different countries. I think those are some of the phenomena that we can talk about when it comes to globalization. But what it's really about is the ability to do anything across borders more than we used to. The ability for people to move and to do things and to cooperate across borders, not to be limited by the specific geographics of your position and of your situation, not to have your fate decided by the place where you were born. And when we talk about that, we must focus on the reasons for this globalization. What is it that has given people the opportunity to do those things for good and for bad? Because when you do things cross borders, you can do good things, but you can also do bad things. You can increase cooperation, you can increase the value that you produce in the economy, but you can also engage in international crime or create pollution across borders or terrorism across borders. So it's really, in a way, value neutral. But the fact that we can do more things across borders is important, and it means a big, great shift from what the world used to be like. Let me first focus on the technological preconditions for globalization in our world, which is a result of growing communications technologies and an increase in the ability to transport things, people, goods across borders. It is about the growing efficiency of different transport technologies, like a growing efficiency of air flight, the deregulation of air flight, which has meant that the price of traveling across borders is now so low that poor students can fly away to another country and protest against deregulation of air flight and other things. It's a big shift. It used to be called the jet set, the small elite that was so wealthy that they were able to fly on jet planes to other places. But the two most important technological shifts that were important for globalizations I would like to focus on are both, we can both take as a starting point the year of 1956. Because in 1956, it was a totally different world. When it comes to communication, let us start with communication. In 1956, the telephone cable under the Atlantic Ocean could only carry 36 phone calls at the same time. 36 phone calls. That makes it quite difficult to integrate markets, to be able to cooperate with others, to be able to get your goods from another place or synchronize prices or anything like that, to source labor from another country, from another continent. Only 36 calls at the same time could be made between Europe and the Americas. Which meant that if you were a student in another country, it was difficult to get access to the Atlantic cable and be able to call home. But it was also difficult to have any kind of international economic cooperation going. 15 years later, it was possible to have 4,000 phone calls going on at the same time because of an increase in the efficiency of the Atlantic cable. But the big shift came with fiber optics cables, making it possible to have millions of calls at the same time, and also lower the price by something like 99.9%. Suddenly then it's possible to be in constant contact with other places, to learn about what is going on, to learn about the shifting prices, to learn about what they are able to do that might help you out. And with the World Wide Web, with the internet, it was suddenly possible to stay in touch with all parts of the world at the same time, which makes it possible with international organizations, multinational companies and all kinds of cooperation across the borders. So that's communications, which is very important, but also the ability to move things around, to move goods across borders. And there the biggest change of all the technologies is the creation, the invention of the container, of container shipping, the big metal box that was actually invented in 1956, the very same year that the Atlantic cable could only carry some few phone calls. In 1956, this suddenly happened. Before the container, what you had to do was to put all the things that you wanted to ship to another part of the country or to another country altogether. You had to carry them from the factory to the truck. You had to offload it manually. You had to lift it into the ship, the boat that is going to another country. It took a lot of time. A boat had to stay in the harbor for something like a week. It was incredibly expensive. It took a lot of muscle power. It was a heavy load, and it was also something that meant that you couldn't really scale it up to a really large scale. But in 1956, the American trucker Malcolm McLean, he had the idea of having a metal box that you could just hold onto the truck and then hoist it straight into the cargo hall of the truck. Overnight, he lowered the cost of loading and offloading a boat by something like 97%. This makes a huge difference because it's difficult to be the best in all kinds of things, to be able to produce a computer all together with all its components and have everything in one place, in one country, in one company. So only a few countries, only a few economic centers in the world before 1956 were able to really have a high technological production going. But suddenly with the container it was possible to specialize and just perhaps be able to be the best when it came to one specific part of the computer, one specific component, and just put it into the container and send it to the other side of the planet. And then suddenly more countries were able to be a part of the global economy. More countries were able to use their labor, to use their ideas to be a part of the world. And then at the same time we had a reform, a deregulation of logistics, of transports generally, so that it was suddenly possible for one company in Shanghai, in China, to make an agreement with one company and say, we want these goods shipped to a specific address in San Francisco. And then that company was suddenly able to hire all the trucks, the boats, the railways, everything, and send it over there and give just one invoice to this company in Shanghai. That makes a big difference. Then everybody, even if they're inland, they can use imported components, they can also export to other parts of the planet. So this combination of communication and of transport made it possible to begin to have a more global economy. We had new competitors, we had freer prices, we had a possibility for more countries to participate. It was possible for countries without much access to capital and technology to start exporting clothes, toys, simple manufacturing. But when you start a factory which produces toys, you also have a factory that's able to produce high technology in the future. If you have harbors and containers that ship simple goods like garments, clothes, then you can in the future also use those harbors to export cell phones or iPhones to another part of the planet. So these technological preconditions were incredibly important for what we call globalization. But there were also important political constraints to globalization that had to be reformed, that had to be dealt with. It does not help much having access to this technology if you cannot use it. The internet is a great thing, but what if you live in Cuba or in North Korea and you're not allowed to have access to it? The container is an amazing thing, but if you live in Zimbabwe, the cost of just sending that truck with a container across the border with vegetables or something, some kind of good in it, is the cost in tariffs, in license requirements, in corruption, in taxes, is actually higher than sending it all the way from South Africa to Sweden or the Americas. So you also need liberalization of the economy, liberalization of these technologies, and the democratic revolution and the liberal revolution that the world has seen since the 1970s has made that possible. It's difficult to remember now, but in the mid-1970s, many people thought that we wouldn't see more of liberal democracy in the world. The US ambassador to the United Nations, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, said in 1975 that he thought that democracy was increasingly tense to the condition of the monarchy in the 19th century, a holdover form of government, one which persists in isolated or peculiar parts of the planet. And he concluded that it has simply no relevance for the future, because at that time the Soviet Empire was strong and it began to expand into Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, and Latin America was ruled by military dictatorships, the Central and Eastern Europe was ruled by dictators. Even India experienced a period of dictatorship at that time. But then it happened, because people fought for their freedom, because more well-educated and richer people, they demand more freedoms in their own lives, and also because they were inspired by others. Communications technologies and a new global media told the world about what was happening in other places. And in the 1980s, communism collapsed, the Soviet Union was dissolved, military and fascist regimes collapsed, apartheid was abolished in South Africa, and we had more democracy in Africa generally. And the big, gigantic economies of India and China that used to live under self-imposed isolation from the rest of the world, they began to liberalize their economies. And rich democracies also opened their markets to more free trade and open financial markets to the rest of the world. In the year 1900, more than 100 years ago, around 0% of the world's population lived in a real democracy with one man and woman, one vote. Because women was most often excluded, and even in those few places where they had the franchise, minorities, ethnic minorities or the poor were excluded from elections. By 1950, 31% of the world's population lived in democracies, and by 2000, 58% of the world population did, according to Freedom House, the civil liberties watchdog. Today, even the remaining dictators have to pay lip service to democracy as an ideal and hold staged elections. And even though they try to control the discussion and censor the internet, people know more about what is going on in the world than ever before. And they have begun to liberalize their markets, even in the most controlled state capitalist or socialist economies, because they've realized that they can gain so much by participating in the global economy. So what does all this mean? If we have this technological change that makes it possible for more people to do more things across borders, and also a political revolution and liberalization that has given, even though it's not perfect, it hasn't reached everybody, it has meant more opportunities for people to do things, to get access to the knowledge, the ideas, the technologies of other places. What does this mean? Well, let's look a little bit at how globalization in many instances sets people free. Because more people can now participate, communicate and cooperate across borders than ever before. And therefore they can also learn more from others than they used to do. They are not limited to the ideas and the technologies that were developed close to them by their own nationalities. Suddenly it means that people can have access to the latest knowledge, and they can use that to improve their businesses, their culture, their research, their societies. That is what globalization, the biggest potential of globalization, being able to use the brain, the talent, the hard work of people, even though they do not live in your vicinity. One of the biggest changes is that it means an economic catch-up. It's easier for poor countries to catch up with the richer, because they can now use and get access to the ideas, the research, the technology that it took other countries much longer time to get access to. Between 1960 and the end of the 1990s, rich countries grew faster than the poor. Only 30% of low and middle income countries grew faster than the United States. It was still a world where people were limited to, most often, to the technologies, the businesses that were close to them. But since the year 2000, 90% of the low and middle income countries have grown faster than the United States, on average by 3%. And this is a huge change which adds up to poverty reduction, to an increase in living standards. In a way, globalization is the biggest thing that has happened to mankind, at least when it comes to the quantitative change. Then it's even bigger than the Industrial Revolution. Because what was the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early 19th century really about? It was about around 200 million people in Europe and North America, about 200 million people, and it took around 50 years on average to double their income. China and India has now done the same thing, 5 times faster with 10 times more people. China and India alone, and then we have all the other low and middle income countries that have done that. So they've done it 5 times faster with 10 times more people. That adds up to a change that is 50 times bigger than the Industrial Revolution. And the biggest change is not the economy, it's not how it grows, that is an important thing. But the biggest thing about that is that it sets people free from the limits that geography and often local politicians or despots put onto their lives. Bill Gates of Microsoft fame put it thus recently: if I had to pick a place in the 1950s where I was born, if I could choose between being of average talent in a small American city and being a genius in one of the low and middle income countries around the world, I would have preferred to be of average talent in a small American city, because there you had access to all the things that made you more productive and made your life easier and better. You had access to capital, technology, education, businesses that could provide you with the know-how and the technology to make your life more productive so that you could get a higher wage. Today, he says, I'd rather be that genius in an Asian country, an African, a Latin American, a South American, or Eastern European country. Because now, when borders are more open, when capital and technology and businesses can move about the world and people can move, then it's possible for capital to find talent almost wherever it hides. And that's a democratic revolution that means that it's no longer the place that you're born that makes the biggest change to the life that you can live. It's possible to get access to the brains, the talent, the ideas of other people, even though you live somewhere else. When I think of globalization, I think of one particular journey that I made to Vietnam, that is still formally a communist dictatorship, but has begun to open up, has begun to liberalize its economy since the 1990s. And that has made a huge change. It has opened up to more of competition in the economy and has made it possible to begin to export large scale. Many companies have invested in Vietnam and started production of garments and clothes. I met one young woman, Tichi, who lived there. She worked in one of those factories producing for other markets. Sometimes it's called a sweatshop. We talk about it as low skill, with low wages and bad working conditions. And that's true if we compare it to the kind of workplaces that we have in parts of the world where we've had an industrial development going for a longer period than 20 years. But to compare to the life that she used to live and the kind of life that some of her neighbors and relatives still make, this is a tremendous change. It has made all the difference in her life. It has given her a much higher wage. She earns now 5 times more than she used to be. It has lifted her and her family out of poverty. But it's also meant that she doesn't have to work day in and day out in the rice fields, which is something she did since she was a young girl. 10 to 14 hours a day in the burning sun or in the intense rain. She now has a job indoors producing shoes for Western markets. She can afford now and this is the biggest change, to forego her son's income. In all previous generations of Vietnamese, they had to put their children to work from an early age. Not because they were mean or evil, but because they were dependent on their labor income for their own survival. Now with this kind of income, she can afford to give her son an education instead, and to make sure that he will get bigger opportunities in the future. Nearly all the children in her own generation used to work. Few do in her son's generation, because during the 1990s, Vietnam experienced rapid growth and increased exports. And in just 5 years, with the increase of globalization and in investments from multinational corporations and access to freer trade across the planet, in just those 5 years, the number of child laborers in Vietnam was reduced by 2.2 million people. And when I talk to Thi about her son's future, she thinks that he has the potential to become a doctor in the future. So when I think of globalization, I do not think of the big multinational institutions or the big multinational companies or any of those large-scale developments. Those are important, they are also part of globalization. But what it really means is the access for common people to ideas, technologies that make them more productive, access to factories with machines and know-how that makes them more productive, access to other markets where they can sell their goods. Because that is where it starts. That is what we didn't have before. We've always had a tiny elite that could travel across the planet. We always had the jet set. But now we have Thi and her son's generation that grow up in a globalized world, and it makes all the difference to them. So when I think of globalization, I think of Thi. That's it for me today. Thank you for your attention, and please go to the website and read more and send questions if you have them. And welcome back next week for the next live session. Thank you.